The oldest Gospels were written decades after the events they describe. No one disputes this. What they describe, however, who wrote them, when, why, and what actually happened, remains one of history's most profound, unsolved mysteries. And the deeper scholars dig, the more the official narrative fragments. What if everything you thought you knew about the historical Jesus was built on incomplete sources? What if the truth lies not in what the texts say, but in what they deliberately omit? Consider this: we possess no writings from Jesus himself, not a single letter, not one word carved by his own hand. Everything we know comes filtered through the memories of followers, written in languages he did not speak, in communities he never visited, decades after his death. The earliest accounts, Paul's letters, barely describe Jesus as a teacher at all. They focus almost entirely on his death and resurrection. The biographical details, they appear later, much later, in texts whose origins remain hotly contested among scholars. The Gospel of Mark, considered by many scholars the earliest account, is a fragmented, hurried narrative. Reading it feels like encountering a story half-remembered by someone in distress. The women flee the tomb in terror. The ending appears cut short, as if the manuscript itself was incomplete or deliberately truncated. Matthew and Luke, written perhaps a decade or two after Mark, seem to have used Mark as a template, yet they contradict him constantly. Jesus' birth narratives are entirely absent from Mark. They appear suddenly in Matthew and Luke, but the stories don't align. Different genealogies, different locations, different details. Scholars call this the synoptic problem. The question is not subtle. If these are accounts of the same events, why do the earliest witnesses tell such different stories? Then there is the Q source. For over a century, scholars have proposed the existence of a lost document, a collection of Jesus' sayings that Matthew and Luke both used, but Mark apparently never knew. This phantom text, reconstructed from patterns in the Gospels themselves, has never been found. It exists only as absence, as silence. Yet its theoretical existence raises questions that shake the foundation of how we understand early Christianity. If Q existed, it contained almost no passion narrative, no crucifixion account. What kind of document would preserve only teachings while omitting the central event that defined Christianity? The Jewish context proves equally vexing. Jesus lived in first-century Palestine, yet the Gospels were written in Greek for communities that had never seen Judea. Details of Jewish practice appear garbled or misunderstood in the texts. Some scholars argue this suggests the evangelists were not Jews, nor were they writing for Jewish audiences. They were writing for Greek-speaking communities far from Jerusalem, interpreting a Jewish rabbi through a foreign cultural lens. Each layer of translation is a layer of distortion. Each retelling reshapes the original. Consider the baptism by John. All four Gospels acknowledge it, which suggests it's historically reliable. Embarrassing details tend to survive. Yet the Gospels seem uncomfortable with it. Why would the sinless Messiah require baptism for the forgiveness of sins? The awkwardness visible in the texts suggests the writers inherited this detail from tradition, but didn't quite know what to do with it. Their discomfort becomes evidence of historical authenticity. But what does it actually mean? Scholars debate fiercely. Some propose Jesus was initially a follower of John, only becoming independent after John's imprisonment. Others argue John saw in Jesus something prophetic. Still others suggest the baptism was later reinterpreted theologically to mean something it never originally meant. The resurrection accounts exemplify the problem perfectly. All four Gospels describe it. None of them describe it the same way. The details contradict. The witnesses differ. The timeline fragments. Yet this central claim, the foundation of Christianity, rests on accounts so disparate that harmonizing them requires conscious effort. If they were eyewitness testimony, Why would independent witnesses disagree so fundamentally about the most important event of their lives? Some scholars propose the disciples experienced visions. Others suggest psychological trauma manifested as spiritual encounter. Still others maintain historical facticity while acknowledging we cannot reconstruct what actually occurred. The texts themselves remain silent on how to resolve this. Centuries after these events, the Church would declare certain Gospels canonical and declare others heretical. But the decision was political, not historical. The texts deemed apocryphal, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the sources now called Q, they possessed equal claim to authority. They simply said different things, and so they were buried. The gods didn't want you to know there were contradictions. But the contradictions remain, and perhaps in those contradictions lies something closer to truth than in any harmonized version. The earliest Christians did not call themselves Christians. They called themselves followers of the Way. And the Way was not monolithic. It fractured almost immediately into competing interpretations, each claiming authority, each possessing texts to justify their vision. Jerusalem Christians looked nothing like Alexandrian Christians. Pauline communities taught doctrines that James, Jesus' own brother, reportedly opposed. Yet only one version survived into orthodoxy. The others were erased. What we call the New Testament is not a historical archive. It is a curated selection, a survival of the fittest, determined not by historical accuracy, but by political power. When Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, the assembled bishops did not discover which books were true. They decided which books would be deemed true. Everything else became heresy. Possession of the wrong texts became punishable by death. This matters because it means our earliest sources about Jesus passed through multiple filters before reaching us. First, the filter of memory. The evangelists were not recording events as journalists. They were interpreting events through theological conviction. Second, the filter of translation. Aramaic became Greek. Concepts shifted in meaning. Third, the filter of community needs. The Gospels were written to address specific crises in specific churches. The Jesus they present is partly historical figure, partly theological construction, partly answer to contemporary problems. Scholars call this the Jesus of history versus the Christ of faith. The distinction is crucial. The Jesus of history is what we might recover through rigorous historical method. The Jewish baptizer who proclaimed the kingdom of God, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate, whose followers claimed resurrection. The Christ of faith is what believers came to understand him as, the divine Son of God, born of a virgin, risen from death, seated at the right hand of the Father. These are not the same person. One is historical, one is theological. The earliest Paul, writing in the 50s CE, a mere 20 years after the crucifixion, says almost nothing about Jesus' life. No birth narrative. No teachings beyond illusions, no miracles or healings. Paul's Jesus is almost purely theological, crucified, resurrected, exalted. When Paul does quote Jesus, he offers very little. When he describes Jesus' brother James, he does so matter-of-factly, as if it were unremarkable that the Messiah had a biological family. Yet later, Gospels would transform Jesus' family into obstacles to faith, or deny they existed at all. Some scholars propose that Jesus' own family, including James, did not initially believe in him. This appears in John's Gospel. If true, it's a striking detail. It suggests Jesus was a controversial figure even to those closest to him. He was not universally recognized as Messiah during his lifetime. The messianic claim came later, after the resurrection experiences. The crucifixion itself raises questions scholars still debate. Why was Jesus executed? The Gospels blame the Jews, but this is theologically motivated language written decades later by communities no longer living in Judea. The historical reality appears more complex. Crucifixion was Roman punishment for sedition. If Jesus was crucified, the Romans saw him as a threat. But what threat exactly? A religious reformer, a political insurgent, a revolutionary? The texts offer competing answers. Jesus appears in Matthew and Mark as apocalyptic preacher predicting the kingdom's imminent arrival. He appears in Luke as a more ethical teacher focused on forgiveness and inclusion. In John, he speaks in abstract philosophical terms about being and light. These are not minor variations. They reflect fundamentally different understandings of who Jesus was and what he taught. Yet all four are deemed canonical. All four are deemed authoritative. Yet they cannot all be simultaneously true in their details. Consider what was not preserved. Jesus wrote nothing. We know nothing of his childhood except two brief contradictory narratives in Matthew and Luke. We have no information about his appearance, his tone of voice, his mannerisms. We do not know if he was married, if he traveled outside Judea, what he studied or how he was trained. The silence is deafening. We possess fragments of a life, arranged and interpreted by communities with theological agendas. Yet from these fragments, one truth emerges clearly. Jesus of Nazareth was a figure so profound, so unsettling, that communities continued arguing about what he meant centuries after his death. That argues for historical substance. Something real happened. Someone real moved people so deeply that they risked their lives to follow. What that something was, however, that mystery remains unresolved. The texts that survive do not answer the question. They embody it, and perhaps that is precisely why they endure. In their contradictions, they preserve not answers, but the living struggle of those trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. If you want to follow the next forbidden truth, if you want to dig deeper into what history actually reveals, follow us. The excavation continues.